I grew up with two brothers. And one thing, if you grew up with brothers or sisters, one thing that you always do is to compare yourself to your brothers. And not only did I grow up with an older brother, but I grew up with a twin brother. So there was always this person that I was always the same age with that I would always compare myself with. Who was the better basketball player? Who was the better video game player? Who was the tallest? Who was the funniest? Everything that we compared ourselves to, especially my twin brother. And now, we're grown up. We're 40, 38 years old, and we're saying we're too mature to compare ourselves now, but that's, I'll let you know a hint, secret. That's not true. We still compare ourselves to each other. We always fall into the comparison trap, especially when we're together. We're like, man, who could be the funniest? Who's the better? Again, still, same questions. Who's the better basketball player? And I know this is true for you, is that oftentimes you find yourself comparing yourself to other people. Now, this is true in school. There's the people that study for like 15 minutes on a test, and you studied like 4-6 hours, and you get the same grade. Like, that's not fair. Then there's your sister who never cleans her room. Her room's always a mess. She never does her laundry or vacuums. But maybe you're the one that cleans, keeps your room straight. She gets to go out with her friends and do all the fun stuff, but you never get to because your room's not clean. That's not fair. Maybe you have to share your car with a brother or a sister, and you're the one that always gasses it up, pays for all the gas, always cleans it, and they never do. Maybe you have to watch the athletes. I remember this in school. You have to watch the athletes. They always got out of school early to go to the big game. That's not fair. And see, this happens all the time. And now you've got social media. You got Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat. And you get to see what everybody else is doing 24/7. And something really weird happens. You always jump to the conclusion that their life is probably better than your life. They got a new car. They got to go on vacation. They got to do this thing. Maybe you see that their family's together all the time. Well, you got to go back and forth between two different families every weekend. Maybe you see that their vacation was awesome and they got to go to this spot on the weekend that you really wanted to. Or maybe they went to this concert that you've been dying to go to, and you're like, man, that's not fair. And they got the newest thing. They got the best thing. They got a new car. They got a raise. And this is a real thing for all of us. See, in addition to feeling like we have to compare ourselves to everybody else, it's always like our comparison leads us to feel miserable about ourselves. We look at what other people put online or what we see in the neighborhood or the stories they tell us, and we see our lives and we're like, my life, it's not that great. It's really not that good. Their life looks better. They look better. We recognize a familiar reality that their life is greater than my life, that my life is less than their life. And so when we feel less than, we typically respond in 3 ways. Number one, we'll probably try to overachieve. We'll probably work real hard to do better, to be better, to live a different life. Maybe we do nothing because we just feel like we can't ever live up, so why even try? Or we play their lives over and over and over in our minds. And so we get anxious or sad or jealous or frustrated, and we try to go out there and make maybe our Instagram posts look even better, and you may find yourself unable to think about anything else but trying to make your life better. But no matter what you try, no matter what you're trying to figure out or how you respond, the results are always the same. Generally, it feels bad. It feels bad to compare. And that's what comparison does. This is the tricky thing about comparing our lives to other people's lives, is that it never ends well for us. And see, we've all compared ourselves. We've all taken someone else's life and measured it up to our life and said, hey, mine's just not that good. Mine's just not that great. See, comparison has become such a norm in our culture that we often don't even realize that we're doing it. And it often is surprising when we realize how often we actually do compare our lives to someone else. And see, we may think that there's no way out of this comparison game, but there is. And see, there's this guy in the New Testament named Paul who writes about how we can win the comparison game every single time. And this may be surprising, but it's true. Now, you may have heard of Paul. Paul was one of Jesus' early and greatest followers. Like Paul gave up everything to follow Jesus. And Paul was serious about his mission to follow Jesus. He was so serious that he wanted other people to experience what he experienced. He was so serious, he wanted people to feel God's love the way he felt God's love. He was so serious that he would stop at nothing to help people find the life, the better life that he had found in Jesus. He wanted so desperately for people to know that they were loved and treasured by Jesus. And so Paul, he traveled around the Mediterranean Sea about 2,000 years ago, and he started a lot of churches. And Paul, he had like the original Instagram and Snapchat, the original DM. He would write letters to churches, and that's how he stayed connected with them. And so a lot of times in these churches, a lot of times in these letters, sometimes Paul would be pretty direct, and he would get right to the point. And sometimes he would say some harsh words to some of the people that he wrote his letters to. Now, we don't have all the letters that Paul wrote, but we do have a few. And there's this one letter, 2 Corinthians, that Paul addresses some people that he has kind of an argument with. And it's apparent, like in 1 Corinthians, he's written this letter and he wants these people to know something about him. But then these same people, they write him back, or maybe Paul has heard some comments back at him, and Paul wants to write again to kind of set the record straight. So listen to how Paul responds to these criticisms. This is 2 Corinthians 10, verse 12. Paul says, "We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise." When they compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. So I'm not sure, but this seems like the ancient tool of sarcasm. Like you have this tool too, right? See, Paul, he claps back at his critics, and he wasn't messing around with this passage. Like he's pretty serious. He's addressing this comparison game that's going on in this church and the struggle that it created. Paul is saying in no uncertain terms, it is absolutely ridiculous. It is so foolish to let your behavior in life be based on a comparison between someone else's behavior in life. He says it's even more ridiculous to spend time figuring out how you measure up to people just like you in order to make yourself look better. If I were to sum things up, Paul was saying, hey, look, comparing any human to another human, it's an ignorant idea and it makes you look silly. It just does. See, there's this principle too found in the book of Proverbs. Now, you may have heard of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs was mostly written by this guy named Solomon. And Solomon was writing to his young son, probably a teenager, maybe around your age. And Solomon wants to help his son figure out how to live the best life, how to get the most out of life, how to stay out of the most trouble, how to, just get a good handle on life and make it through life the best way he can. Now, you may know the story of Solomon. Solomon was one of the wisest men on the planet. And not only was he wise, but Solomon was rich beyond measure. Solomon had everything. Solomon had so much money, so many palaces. He had a bunch of wives, which was really problematic. But Solomon, just rich beyond compare. Now, this is really, really important. We're going to come back to this in a minute. But if there was anybody who didn't have to compare himself to anybody else, it was Solomon. Because Solomon had everything. Everybody looked up to Solomon and measured their lives against Solomon's. You would think that Solomon would never, ever compare his life to other people, but Solomon was a human being just like you and I are. Solomon knew the traps, and he probably fell into the trap of comparison so often, probably just as often as we do. But Solomon wrote something really, really wise and something really, really smart. In Proverbs 4, verse 23, he says to his young son, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Everything you do flows from it. Now, Solomon, again, the wisest man that there ever was passionate about how important it is to guard his heart, because he knew the traps that could befall someone if they didn't. Because what we do almost always comes from what's in our heart. And see, the opposite thing is true too. What we do often, if we don't guard our hearts, comes from what we think other people want us to do. And what we think other people want us to do often comes from when we compare ourselves to others. See, if we see a post about how great a restaurant is that someone went to, guess the next restaurant we want to go to. Or if we see a post about a show that somebody watched, guess which show on Netflix we're going to go watch. Or if we see something that somebody did, what's the next thing that we're going to want to do? Well, we saw it on there. But what Solomon knows is that comparing yourself to other people's lives, it doesn't work. It's a game that nobody wins. It's a game that only has losers in it. And see, you know this. When you compare your life to someone else, it leads to sadness, it leads to frustration, it leads to anger, it leads to sorrow, it leads you to being miserable. You could say it like this: to compare leads to despair. To compare leads to despair. So Solomon would say, look, guard your heart about what you let in. Because the things that you're going to let in are the things that you're going to compare your life to. So how do you guard your heart? Well, you guard your heart about who you follow on Instagram. You guard your heart when you guard who you follow on TikTok. You guard your heart when you guard who you follow on Snapchat. You guard your heart when the people who influence you, that you pay very careful attention to who you let influence you. You guard your heart when you see something on TV and you really want that thing. You guard your heart when you interact with people who make you feel less about yourself. You guard your heart when you spend time with people who constantly complain and constantly don't guard their heart. See, in other words, when you find yourself in a situation, whether it's on social media or real life, where you are more likely to compare your life with others, be on guard. Pay attention to what's going on. Something is trying to get to your heart, and you need to set a boundary there. So much of this can be tough to notice in the moment, but that's why being on guard is so very helpful. So pay attention to what you do when you feel yourself spiraling into this pit of comparison. Maybe you find yourself overachieving or striving for the attention of someone else. Maybe you find yourself just not doing anything, feeling deflated, and you're like, well, why do I even try? Or maybe you find yourself playing the images or words over and over in your mind. And when those things happen, pay attention, because your emotions are telling you something. And that's a clue that you're about to get stuck in this comparison game. So when this happens, ask yourself these questions. What things are fueling how I feel? Like, what is it in your life? Is it someone else? Is it jealousy? Is it anger? Is it envy? Is it what someone else did with their free time that's fueling how you're feeling? What's influencing your emotions? Number two, what are some things I want to do because of how I feel? Sometimes that's a clue. What or who am I comparing myself to that's bringing up these feelings? We guard our hearts by paying attention to what we feel when we're tempted to play the comparison game. This may seem like a really big task. That's why we're going to ask you a couple questions to help you think through what we're going to talk about. So I want to encourage you this week to guard your heart and to be careful when you step into that comparison game. See, you aren't the only one who struggles to compare your life with someone else's. But living a life where you feel less than doesn't have to define how you feel. And it certainly doesn't need to define your worth. Remember, to compare leads to despair. So what would it look like if you began to guard your heart when it comes to comparing your life to others? Imagine being able to walk in confidence about who you are, and imagine how different your day would be. So we want to keep this conversation rolling. So I got 3 questions that I want to ask you when it comes to compare. See, number 1, what's one area where you tend to compare your life to other people's? What's one area of your life where you tend to compare your life with others? Number 2, you know that we all have expectations about who we're supposed to be. Is there an area of your life where you're disappointed in who you are? And number 3, read Proverbs 4:23 again. Why do you think it matters that you guard your heart? And what is one area of your life you need to guard better. Y'all, thanks for joining us this week. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next week.